You probably think you know how this story ends. A rich old man, a housekeeper, a quiet moment in the garden. Sounds simple, right? But let me ask you something. What would make a millionaire freeze in place, speechless, as he watches someone society often overlooks teach his own blood something he never could? What could possibly make a man with power, pride, and legacy drop everything and do something no one, not even his own family, saw coming? That day started like any other. But by sunset, the house wasn't the same. My grandfather wasn't the same. And none of us were ever the same again. This isn't just a story about race, money, or status. It's about what happens when truth speaks through the softest voice, and who listens when it does. What he saw shook him. What he did next, it shook us all. Enjoy the story. It was late afternoon when I arrived at my grandfather's estate. That kind of quiet hour when the sun hangs low and warm light spills across the marble floors like a soft memory. The house always felt too grand for real life. Gilded picture, frames, velvet furniture no one dared sit on, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, but expectant, like the walls were waiting for something to happen. I had come by for a casual visit, nothing more. My grandfather, Leonard Whitmore, had never been a man of warmth. He was sharp-edged, business-minded, and terrifyingly intelligent, a titan of steel and finance. But as I walked in that day, something was different. He wasn't on the phone, barking orders. He wasn't buried in his Wall Street Journal or adjusting the volume on his vintage record player. No. He was standing by the tall, arched window, perfectly still, his gaze fixed outside. I followed his eyes, curious, and that's when I saw them. Down in the garden, past the trimmed hedges and carefully manicured flowers, were two figures. One of them was my little cousin Elliot, barely 3 years old, wobbling on his tiny legs, his mouth forming soft sounds as he tried to speak. And beside him, kneeling with patience and grace, was Maria, the black housekeeper who had been working in our family home for nearly a decade. But this wasn't her working. She wasn't sweeping, she wasn't polishing, she was teaching. Her hands moved slowly, her words were gentle, and Elliot was locked in complete attention. I turned back to my grandfather, expecting a frown, a comment, a sigh. But what I saw instead was a man frozen, not in anger, but in something deeper, something I couldn't yet name. Not then, but I would, very soon. Maria had worked in that house longer than I had been alive. But to most of my family, she was just part of the background, like the ticking of the grandfather clock or the clink of silverware on fine china. She moved through rooms unnoticed, spoke only when spoken to, and carried the kind of grace that only comes from years of being invisible. But that day, she wasn't background. She was the center. There she was, in the middle of the garden, her hands moving gently as she helped little Elliot form his first full sentence. Her voice was low and melodic, the kind that made even the birds pause in the trees above. "Say it with me, Elliot. I am smart, I am kind, I am strong." And he did, slowly, with that babyish lisp of his. He repeated every word, his eyes fixed on hers like she was the only person in the world that mattered. And my grandfather, the man who ruled over boardrooms and bulldozed competitors without blinking, was watching like a child seeing magic for the first time. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. He stood behind the glass like a statue, a man of power staring at something he could never buy, never control, never fully understand. Maria wasn't just teaching Elliot how to speak. She was doing something far more radical. She was planting belief in a child whose world was built on power, not kindness. She was shaping his identity in a way no private tutor ever could. And for the first time in my life, I saw my grandfather realize that maybe he wasn't the teacher in this house. Maybe he never was. Later that evening, long after Maria had returned to the kitchen and Elliot had fallen asleep with his toy truck still clutched in his hand, I found my grandfather sitting alone in the sunroom. The lights were low, casting long shadows across the marble floor, and the faint scent of his old cigar still lingered in the air. even though he hadn't smoked in years. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, watching him sip slowly from a glass of scotch he hadn't touched in almost a decade. Something about him felt smaller. Not physically, but in presence. Like a man who had been knocked off the pedestal he built for himself, not by force, but by truth. Finally, he spoke. "Did you see her?" he asked, his voice rough as if the words had been waiting inside his chest all day. I nodded. "She's good with Elliot." He didn't respond right away. He just stared into his glass like it held answers. "I never taught my son how to speak like that," he muttered. "Never told him he was smart or kind or strong. I just taught him how to win." That silence between us grew heavier, pressing against the windows like the night itself was listening. He wasn't talking about Elliot anymore. He was talking about Elliot's father, my uncle. The same uncle who hadn't visited the mansion in over 4 years. The same uncle who grew up desperate for approval and left chasing the kind of success that made you hollow inside. My grandfather set the glass down gently, then looked at me with eyes that, for the first time, weren't filled with pride or power, but regret. "She did more for that boy in 10 minutes than I did in 10 years with mine." I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know if he meant to say it aloud. But in that moment, something cracked open, not just in him, but in everything we thought this family was built on. The next morning came with a strange kind of stillness, like the house itself was waiting to see what Leonard Whitmore would do next. My grandfather was a man of routine: black coffee at 6, news by 6:30, orders to the staff by 7. But that morning, he didn't speak. He walked past the dining room, ignored his untouched breakfast, and stepped outside, to the garden. And there she was again, Maria, kneeling beside Elliot, gently correcting his pronunciation as he stumbled through the words, "Thank you," and "please." My grandfather stood behind them quietly for a moment before he did something none of us could have predicted. He sat down, on the same grass, beside them. He didn't speak at first, and neither did she. But that silence said more than words ever could. For a man like him, lowering himself, physically, emotionally, was monumental. It wasn't just about humility. It was about recognition. For the first time, he wasn't observing Maria. He was joining her. That moment was surreal. I stood from the upstairs balcony, watching my grandfather mirror the body language of a woman he had barely acknowledged for years. She glanced at him, surprised, unsure, but didn't move away. Instead, she offered him the same tone she used with Elliot. Soft, steady, unwavering. "Would you like to help him too, sir?" she asked. My grandfather blinked, as if startled to be given permission instead of control. Then, slowly, he nodded. And together they worked on words with Elliot. "Say it again," my grandfather said gently now. "I am strong." Elliot smiled. "Strong." And then something happened I never thought I'd see in my life. My grandfather laughed. Not politely, not out of obligation, but freely, fully, like something inside him was finally breathing again. Afterward, Maria began to rise, brushing grass from her skirt. My grandfather stood too, and for a moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but something unspoken passed between them. Not equality, not yet, but respect. A man born into privilege, who'd spent his entire life giving commands, had just been taught something by the very person he was taught to overlook. As he turned to walk back inside, I noticed he didn't walk in front of her. He walked beside her. That may seem small, but in our family, in that house, with that man, it was revolutionary. The house changed after that, not all at once and not in ways most people would notice. But for those of us who had lived within those walls long enough, we felt it. The tension that used to hover like a chandelier over the staff's heads began to ease. The rigid schedules loosened. Even the way my grandfather's footsteps echoed down the halls seemed softer. It was as if a layer of frost had melted from the old man's spirit, allowing warmth to seep through the cracks he had sealed shut for decades. Maria kept doing her work. She never let her guard down, never expected praise. But there was a difference now. When my grandfather passed her in the hallway, he looked her in the eyes. He said, "Good morning." Simple but revolutionary, in a house where silence had always meant superiority. One afternoon, I overheard two of the other maids whispering in the pantry. "Did you see him yesterday?" one said. He opened the door for her. The other gasped, as if someone had confessed to seeing the Pope in pajamas. He asked if she needed anything, like with manners. The whispers weren't filled with sarcasm or disbelief. They were filled with something new. Hope. Hope that maybe the hierarchy in the Whitmore estate wasn't carved in stone after all. I realized that Maria, without even meaning to, was disrupting an entire legacy of silence with nothing but compassion, consistency, and the undeniable power of presence. She had become more than a housekeeper. She was now the quiet force shifting the very foundation of the home, a home that had long forgotten what dignity looked like from the bottom up. But not everyone welcomed this change. At dinner that night, my aunt, sharp-tongued and dripping with entitlement, made a comment that sliced through the room like a cold blade. "I see Father's gone soft," she said, swirling her wine with judgment. "Next thing you know, he'll be inviting the help to sit at the table." The silence that followed was suffocating, but my grandfather didn't flinch. He didn't scold her. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at her and said, "Maybe it's time someone else taught this family how to behave." His words didn't just silence her, they shook the air itself. It was the first time I saw the power dynamic turn. The master of the house wasn't defending a servant. He was standing beside someone who had earned his respect, in a way none of us ever had. I had known Maria for years, but I had never really known her. She was just there, quiet, punctual, polite, always a step behind, never drawing attention, never crossing lines. But now, with everything shifting, I began to see her in a different light. There was something in the way she carried herself, not like a woman who served, but like a woman who had survived. That kind of strength doesn't come from training. It comes from pain. One afternoon, as the light poured into the kitchen through the large bay window, I sat across from her while she folded napkins into perfect triangles. "Maria," I said softly, unsure if I even had the right to ask, "how did you know what to say to him? To Elliot, I mean." She didn't stop folding, but her eyes lifted slowly, and something behind them flickered. Not surprise, not defensiveness, but memory. "I had a son once," she said, and just those 5 words pulled the oxygen from the room. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady, like it had told the story many times before, just never out loud. His name was Isaiah, brightest boy I ever knew, could recite poems by 5, knew every constellation by 7. She smiled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. But the world doesn't always see brilliance when it comes wrapped in brown skin, especially when you come from where we did. I felt a tightness in my chest as she continued. "I used to tell him those same words. You are smart. You are kind. You are strong. Every single day before school. I believed if he heard it enough times, the world wouldn't break him." She stopped folding for a moment and stared at her hands. "But the world doesn't care how much you believe." It took him anyway. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't have to. The silence that followed told me everything. Grief doesn't always show up in tears. Sometimes it hides in routines, in perfect napkin folds, in the way someone teaches a stranger's child like it's the last thing that matters in the world. Maria looked up again and smiled. This time, real. When I saw Elliot, I saw Isaiah. Not in his face, in his spirit. And I thought, maybe, this time, those words will stick. I sat there stunned. Not by her pain, but by her strength. My grandfather hadn't just been watching a woman teach his grandson how to speak. He had witnessed a mother passing on a legacy her own child never got to finish. And suddenly, everything made sense. Everything. A few days later, while helping my grandfather organize some old documents in his study, a ritual he only ever did when something weighed heavy on his mind. I opened the bottom drawer of his oak desk and found something unexpected. It wasn't a will or some stock certificate. It was a letter, folded twice, old, faded, unmarked envelope. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I knew better than to open it without asking. I handed it to him, and for a moment he just stared at it. Then he sighed, that long, weary kind of breath that only comes when the past comes knocking, and you know it's time to open the door. "You can read it," he said quietly. And so I did. The letter was from Maria, dated nearly 8 years earlier, long before that afternoon in the garden. And as I read, a different version of this story began to unfold. In the letter, Maria explained that when she first took the job, she didn't expect kindness, only work. But what she hadn't anticipated was Elliot. He had just been born at the time. She wrote about how she'd watch him sleep in the nursery during her break, how she'd hum soft lullabies from her childhood as she cleaned, how she had silently promised herself that if life ever gave her another chance to shape a child's soul, she'd take it. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't expect recognition. She simply wanted to give something good to the world again, something she lost when she lost her son. And in the final lines of the letter, she wrote something that stopped me cold. "If he ever speaks words that sound like mine, forgive me. I just wanted to give him the voice my son never got to use." I looked up at my grandfather, whose hands trembled slightly as he took the letter back. He sat down in silence, eyes misting in a way I'd never seen. Not for war, not for business, not even for funerals, but for this, for the woman he had never fully seen, yet who had been offering her soul in quiet moments for almost a decade. "I never knew she wrote this," he whispered. "Never opened it. I thought it was a complaint, maybe, or a request. I didn't have time back then." His voice broke. "I should have made time." And in that moment, the man who had built skyscrapers, crushed competition, and made millions, was undone by a letter from a woman he barely spoke to. That's how powerful truth is. It doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be opened. It was the following Sunday when the entire family gathered for lunch, something rare and usually only done for birthdays, holidays, or appearances. The long mahogany table was set with its usual flair: crystal glasses, porcelain dishes, cutlery that gleamed under the chandelier like rows of tiny swords. Everyone was seated in their proper places, status preserved through proximity to the head of the table, where my grandfather always sat like a king presiding over his court. But that day, things didn't go as expected. As the staff moved in and out with dishes, something unusual happened. Maria walked in, not through the kitchen entrance like always, but through the main archway. She was carrying Elliot on her hip, his little arms draped around her neck like vines on a trusted tree. Conversations froze. Forks paused mid-air. You could feel the discomfort crawl across the table like static. No one said anything. Yet. Then, as if orchestrated by a force greater than us all, Elliot looked up and said loud and proud, "I am strong." His little voice echoed through the silence like a bell in a cathedral. My grandfather, still seated at the head, smiled. Not a subtle smile, a full one. Then he stood up, pulled the chair next to him and said, "Maria, would you sit?" Gasps were stifled. My aunt dropped her spoon. Someone muttered something under their breath. But Maria, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of instinct. You don't just walk into a lion's den and take a seat beside the lion. Not after years of being invisible. But Elliot tugged at her collar and whispered, "Please." And so she did. She sat beside my grandfather, Elliot on her lap, as if that seat had always been hers. It was the first time anyone not born into the Whitmore bloodline had ever sat there. But in that moment, no one questioned it, not even the ones who wanted to. Throughout the meal, my grandfather didn't speak much. He just watched, observed. And in the spaces between courses, he leaned over and asked Maria about her childhood, about Isaiah, about the words she taught Elliot. Every answer she gave, he listened to with the intensity of a man who had finally realized he'd spent his life at the wrong end of the conversation. And the rest of us? We watched the world shift in real time. Not because of a press release, not because of a dramatic explosion, but because a little boy said 6 words, and a powerful man finally made space for a woman who had never been invited to speak. That's when I understood something for the first time. Family isn't always who you share blood with. Sometimes, family is the person who shows up every day, with a heart full of stories and hands full of grace, and teaches your children to speak the truth, even when no one else is listening. Later that evening, as the guests dispersed and the echo of fine dining faded into the silence of night, I found myself in the sitting room with Maria. Elliot had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted from the excitement of being the unexpected center of attention. The fire crackled gently behind us, throwing flickers of light onto the bookshelves and casting shadows that danced like quiet ghosts on the walls. Maria rocked him slowly, humming something low and beautiful, a tune that felt older than the house itself. I sat across from her, unsure of what to say, afraid that anything would break the fragile peace surrounding us. But then she looked up at me and asked the one question I never expected. "Do you think he really sees me now?" Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't hopeful either. It was simply tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from waiting too long for dignity to arrive. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say, of course, but I hesitated. Not because I doubted my grandfather's change, but because I understood how deep the wounds were that led her to ask that. Recognition isn't just about looking at someone, it's about seeing who they've always been, not just who they are when they finally step into your view. I nodded slowly. "I think he's finally listening," I said, "and maybe that's the start of something more." Maria smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carries years behind it. "Listening is good," she whispered, brushing a curl from Elliot's forehead. "But it's what comes after that matters." I realized then that Maria wasn't waiting for validation. She was waiting to see if real change would follow. Respect that lasts beyond the moment. Acknowledgement that doesn't fade when the chairs are pushed back and the lights go out. Not long after, my grandfather entered the room. He didn't announce himself. He didn't clear his throat. He just stepped in quietly, like a man who had finally learned the value of silence. He looked at Maria, at Elliot asleep in her arms, and then at me. "I'd like to speak with her," he said gently. I stood up, but Maria didn't move. Not out of disrespect, but because she needed to know he meant it. He walked over and sat beside her, closer than I'd ever seen him. "Sit to anyone outside the family." "I don't know how to say this," he began, "but I need to try. Thank you, Maria, not just for today. For everything. For what I never noticed. For what I never asked." She looked at him, really looked, and nodded once. And in that moment, a quiet agreement was made. No contracts, no promises, just a shared understanding that the old ways were gone, and something new had finally begun. A week later, my grandfather did something no one in the family could make sense of. He called a gathering, not a formal dinner or a business announcement, but a private moment in the drawing room. No tuxedos, no grand speeches, just a handful of people. Maria, myself, my aunt and uncle, and a few close relatives who still clung tightly to the old ways. The mood was tense. My aunt arrived first, wearing her usual smirk, arms folded, as if bracing for a scandal. My uncle kept glancing at the clock, clearly expecting this to be another self-indulgent legacy monologue. But then my grandfather entered, holding a small rectangular box, no bigger than a book, wrapped in soft blue velvet. He walked straight to Maria, placed the box gently in her hands, and simply said, "This belonged to someone very important, to me. And now I want it to belong to you." Maria didn't open it at first. She just held it, unsure if this was a trap, a gesture, or a test. My aunt rolled her eyes. "What is this? A retirement gift?" she scoffed. but my grandfather silenced her with a single glance, not harsh, not angry, but definitive. Then he turned back to Maria. "My mother used to wear this pendant," he said. "She was the one person who taught me how to speak with purpose, not power. I lost that lesson for most of my life. You reminded me of it." With trembling fingers, Maria opened the box. Inside was a delicate gold necklace, simple, understated, but clearly old and meaningful. The pendant was a tiny book locket, worn smooth from years of touch. Maria gasped softly, her hand moving to her chest as if to calm her own heart. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You already have," my grandfather replied. "You gave something to this family that none of us could, not just to Elliot, but to me. You brought back words I forgot how to use. Kindness, patience, truth." He took a breath, voice steady now. "This isn't a payment. It's a thank you, from a man who never said it when he should have." The room fell silent. No rebuttals, no snide remarks. Even my aunt didn't speak. For once, the air wasn't heavy with expectation or tradition. It was filled with something rarer: reverence. Maria closed the box and nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't bow. She simply looked him in the eyes and said, "You're welcome." And in that exchange, so small, so profound, a generational wall crumbled. Not because of wealth, but because one man learned how to give the one thing he never gave before: respect without condition. A few days after the gift exchange, I noticed something else had changed. Not in the people, but in the space itself. The walls of my grandfather's estate were lined with portraits, oil paintings of ancestors in stiff collars, sepia-toned photographs of long-dead magnates, all staring out as if their legacy alone justified the weight of the mansion's silence. But one space at the end of the main hallway, the one that had remained empty for years, had finally been filled. And what hung there wasn't a member of the Whitmore bloodline. It was a photograph, a recent one, in soft black and white, of Maria and Elliot in the garden, mid-laughter. She was holding a book open on her lap, and Elliot was pointing at something on the page, his face lit up in joy. The image was framed in simplicity. No gold, no plaque, and yet it was, by far, the most human thing in that entire hallway. And my grandfather had placed it there himself. The staff noticed first. One of the gardeners whispered to me the day after it went up. He asked for it to be hung higher than all the others. And it was, just slightly, but noticeably. The message wasn't subtle. It was a declaration. In this house, the ones who shaped hearts mattered more than those who just signed deeds. My aunt passed it and flinched, almost as if the frame burned her pride. My uncle avoided the hallway entirely. But the rest of us, we paused, we looked. Some of us even smiled, because that portrait wasn't just a tribute, it was a course correction. A quiet rewriting of history, one photograph at a time. That evening, I found my grandfather standing in front of the picture, alone, hands behind his back, not in judgment, but in reflection. I approached him slowly, and for a while, we both just stared. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to think legacy was about how many buildings had my name on them, how many people feared me, how much I left behind in numbers." He turned to me, and his eyes were clearer than I'd ever seen them. "But now I wonder if the real legacy is the person we never hired to teach, yet somehow taught us everything." He chuckled softly. "All these years I thought I was the one shaping this family. Turns out, it was her all along." And in that moment, I didn't see a tycoon. I didn't see a titan. I saw a man, finally learning that love, humility, and voice are the only things worth passing on. Weeks passed, and the tension that once ruled the Whitmore estate seemed to dissolve into something more human. Not perfect, but possible. The rigid formal dinners began to feel less like business meetings and more like meals. Laughter returned to the halls. Elliot grew bolder, more expressive, and his words, the ones Maria taught him, became part of the family vocabulary. Even my grandfather, once known for cutting people off mid-sentence, began to ask questions and actually wait for the answers. Then came a particular Sunday evening dinner that I'll never forget. The table was full, as usual, but this time something new happened. Maria entered not as a servant, but as a guest. She wore a navy blue dress that wasn't fancy, but elegant in the quiet way she always was. She didn't carry plates. She didn't hover at the edge of the room. She was invited to sit, and not at the end. My grandfather had placed her seat 2 chairs from his own. The moment was quiet but seismic. You could feel the eyes around the table doing the mental math of status and tradition, trying to understand the equation that allowed a housekeeper to become part of the table, and still failing to make it make sense. But Elliot beamed. "Maria's sitting with us," he shouted, proudly banging his little spoon against the table. And that was it. No one dared challenge the boy's joy. Even the staunchest relatives remained silent, their discomfort now outweighed by the weight of change already too far gone to reverse. As dinner was served, this time by others, Maria shared stories. She told us about her grandmother who taught her to read using hymnals. She spoke of the church choir she once sang in and how she missed the sound of voices rising together without competition. For the first time, the family wasn't performing wealth. They were receiving wisdom. My grandfather said little during the meal, but he watched her closely, not with scrutiny, but with something bordering on admiration. And when dessert arrived, he lifted his glass and cleared his throat. "To Maria," he said, "who reminded us what family sounds like, when it speaks with love instead of ego." There was no forced clapping, no uncomfortable toasts, just stillness. And then, one by one, glasses were raised. Not because they had to, but because it was right. That evening didn't end with declarations or drama. It ended with Maria telling Elliot a bedtime story by the fireplace, while the rest of us listened, from the couch like children ourselves. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a museum. It felt like a home. And the woman who used to clean its corners had become the one filling it with light. A month later, everything shifted again. This time, not with a gesture or a glance, but with ink. My grandfather had summoned the family to the study on a gray Thursday morning. The air was heavy, not with sorrow, but with expectation. Everyone assumed it was about estate planning, the usual talk of inheritance, legal structures, and trusts. That kind of meeting was nothing new in the Whitmore lineage. But what followed wasn't typical. It wasn't even business. It was personal. He began by acknowledging the room, not by name or title, but with eyes that lingered on each of us, as if silently asking whether we were ready to hear what he had been waiting his whole life to say. Then he handed us copies of a new document, his revised will. The pages were thick and weighty, and yet what made them heavier was not the wealth inside, but the name written into the folds of Legacy, Maria Jean Ellis. Gasps erupted. My aunt nearly choked on her water. My uncle muttered something beneath his breath, sharp and angry. "You're leaving what to her?" he snapped, his face pale, his jaw trembling in disbelief. My grandfather remained calm, seated like a mountain, unmoved by the storm it created. "She's not just receiving something," he replied. "She's restoring something." The new will granted Maria not only a financial inheritance, enough to ensure her comfort for life, but a seat on the board of the educational foundation he had once built in name only. "She will oversee the literacy programs," he said, "because she knows better than any of us what it means to give someone a voice." That line silenced even the most indignant protests, because it was true. We had watched it happen. Not in theory, but in the garden, in the dining room, in Elliot's heart. Maria sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply whispered, "I don't need this." But my grandfather looked at her and said, "I do." And in that simple exchange, decades of inherited blindness began to clear. The will wasn't just about money. It was a mirror, a reflection of what he had ignored, what he had learned, and what he now wanted to honor. It was the final act of a man who had spent his whole life building walls, and now, at last, was choosing to build a door. Not for himself, but for the woman who walked through life quietly transforming everyone around her. And this time, he didn't just leave her a seat at the table. He gave her the keys to rebuild the room. A few weeks after the will was announced, my grandfather's health began to decline. Not in dramatic fashion, but in the slow, dignified way that only men like him seemed to go. He didn't complain, he didn't fight. He simply began to fade like the last light of a long evening. The house grew quieter, the staff moved with more care. Even Elliot, young as he was, seemed to sense the shift, asking fewer questions and holding Maria's hand more often. One morning, my grandfather asked to be taken to the garden. He hadn't stepped outside in days. The sun was soft, filtered through the high branches, and the same bench where he once watched Maria and Elliot became his chosen place to sit one last time. Maria walked beside him, no longer just an employee, but something closer to family than blood had ever allowed. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. He looked out over the grass, the flower beds, the quiet corners where the echoes of laughter still seemed to linger. "I spent most of my life thinking this garden was mine," he said at last, voice faint but clear. But it wasn't. It belonged to the ones who gave it life. The ones who didn't sit inside counting numbers, but came out here and actually lived. Maria nodded, tears gently brimming in her eyes but never falling. She sat beside him, and together they watched Elliot in the distance, now confidently reading aloud from a children's book under a tree. His voice was clear, strong, proud, echoing those same words Maria had once whispered into the wind. "I am smart. I am kind. I am strong." My grandfather placed his hand over hers. It was thin, wrinkled, but steady. "Thank you," he said again, this time not as a man of power, but as one who had finally let go of the armor he wore for too long. "You didn't just give him words. You gave me silence I could listen to." Maria didn't reply with words. She just gripped his hand in return, holding him with the same strength she used to hold the weight of every room she entered quietly for years. That afternoon, as the sun began to lower and the shadows grew long across the Whitmore estate, two people sat on a bench, not as master and servant, not as donor and beneficiary, but as two souls who, in the final chapters of life, had finally met in the same sentence. My grandfather passed away 3 days later, just before dawn, in the same bed he had slept in for nearly half a century. The house was silent that morning, not out of grief, but reverence. It felt as if even the walls were holding their breath. No rushing, no alarms, just stillness. I was there when the doctor declared him gone, and so was Maria. She stood in the corner of the room, not intruding, not retreating, simply present, like she had always been. As the family gathered, some cried, others talked in hushed voices about arrangements, legacy, what would happen next. But what struck me most wasn't what was said after he died. It was what he said just before. The night prior, I had stayed with him for hours. He barely spoke, just held my hand from time to time. But near the end, he turned his head slightly toward the door and asked, "Is she here?" I knew exactly who he meant. I nodded and Maria stepped into view. He smiled faintly, then raised his hand with effort. She came closer. And then, with the last ounces of breath left in him, he whispered something so quietly, only I and she could hear it. "You made me human again." That was it. No grand declarations, no business advice, no cryptic messages for the heirs. Just a simple truth, directed not at his legacy, but at the woman who had reshaped it. Maria didn't weep. She placed her hand gently on his chest and whispered back, "Rest now. I'll keep the garden alive." Those were the final words spoken in that room before the light left his eyes. And somehow, it felt complete. Like a circle had closed. Like a weight had been lifted. Not just from him, but from the walls, the air, the name itself. At the funeral, many came. Executives, politicians, old colleagues, all dressed in dark suits and heavy faces. but no one could understand why the photograph on the altar wasn't one of him at a gala or in front of a skyscraper. It was the picture of him sitting in the garden with Maria and Elliot, laughing, the same one he had framed weeks earlier. Beneath it was a simple inscription, chosen by him. He built an empire, but found his soul in the garden. When the service ended, Elliot pulled at Maria's dress and asked, "Is Grandpa in the sky now?" She knelt down, kissed his forehead, and said, "Yes, baby, and he's finally at peace." That night, as the family dispersed and the house grew quiet again, I walked through the garden alone. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking in my grandfather's footsteps. I was walking in hers. Months have passed since my grandfather's funeral, and the estate has become something new. Not in structure. The marble pillars still stand, the chandelier still glistens in the foyer, and the portraits of old money still line the walls. But the spirit of the place has changed. The hush that once demanded obedience has been replaced with music, laughter, and conversations that carry through open windows. Maria never left. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had been offered her own home, a new position, a title even. But because, in her words, some gardens are worth tending even when the season changes. She now runs the Whitmore Literacy Initiative, a program that serves underprivileged children across the city. Elliot, now 5, is one of its proud ambassadors. He speaks with clarity, kindness, and strength, a reflection of the 3 words that shaped him before he even understood their meaning. As for the family, not everyone stayed. Some couldn't accept the changes. Some left with bitterness, unable to sit in a house where the past had been rewritten without their permission. But the ones who remained grew in ways I never thought possible. My aunt, once allergic to humility, now volunteers on weekends, reading books to children who remind her uncomfortably of the ones she never made time for. My uncle, the one who scoffed at Maria's seat at the table, now funds scholarships in Isaiah's name. The son Maria lost, whose legacy now lives through countless children who would have never had a chance. And me? I write, I tell stories. Not for profit, not for status, but because one woman taught me that stories are the inheritance that matter. Not just the ones we receive, but the ones we choose to carry forward. There's a new bench in the garden now. It's engraved with a quote that Maria chose herself. It reads, "The quietest voices often plant the deepest roots." Visitors stop and read it. Children play around it. And sometimes, in the late afternoon, I'll see Maria there, sitting with Elliot, reading under the same tree where it all began. No fanfare, no audience, just presence, just purpose. And every time I see them there, I remember my grandfather's last words, not because they were poetic or grand, but because they were honest. He didn't leave behind just money. He left behind space, space for a new voice, a new rhythm, a new kind of power to rise where silence once ruled. And if you ask me what truly shocked everyone, it wasn't what he did. It was who he finally listened to. That's the story. That's the truth. And now, it belongs to all of us. In the end, my grandfather didn't leave behind just a name etched in granite or a fortune measured in zeros. He left behind something far more valuable, the transformation of a house into a home, of a legacy into a lesson, of silence into something sacred. Listening. Not the kind of listening you do with your ears, but the kind you do with your soul. He left behind the sound of Elliot's voice echoing truth that once went unsaid. He left behind the warmth in Maria's steps as she walks freely through rooms she once tiptoed across. He left behind a garden that doesn't just grow flowers anymore. It grows futures. And above all, he left behind a truth that challenges all of us, that it's never too late to change the way your story ends. I walk through that garden often now, sometimes with Maria, sometimes with Elliot, and sometimes alone, listening to the wind carry laughter through the branches above. And I wonder, how many stories like this go untold? How many Marias are out there, planting seeds in the lives of others, unseen, unthanked, but undeniably powerful. How many people are standing at the edge of transformation, needing only one moment of recognition to bloom? My grandfather, a man who built towers, didn't find meaning until he sat down in the dirt and looked a woman like Maria in the eyes. And it didn't make him smaller, it made him real. So if you're watching this, listening to this, or simply sitting in silence right now, ask yourself, who in your life has been speaking without being heard? Whose voice have you dismissed because it came softly or came from below? And what would happen if you truly listened, not out of charity, not out of guilt, but out of humility? Maybe you too would be shocked at what comes next. Because the ones who change us the most often aren't the loudest or the richest. They're the ones who teach without speaking loud and love without needing applause. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched your heart, share it. Because some stories aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be planted, like seeds in the garden, waiting to bloom in someone else's silence. End of story.